You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 125. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Have you ever noticed that there seems to be a voice inside your head that has an ongoing narrative that is not all that friendly? Some people refer to this as the inner critic. It's also referred to as negative self-talk. And if you're like most of us, then chances are you've had one or two interactions, at least, with this inner critic. Today's podcast episode is a deep dive into taming the inner critic. It is a voice, a situation that so many lawyers can relate to. And so we're devoting this episode to figuring out how this inner critic may be slowing you down, how this inner critic may actually be helping you, and how you can make peace with it going forward. Now, the inner critic is a problem that I've heard described by various coaching clients. Sometimes they use the word inner critic, but most of the time they do not. Here's how you can tell if you may have a situation with your inner critic. At work, for example, you might be hearing an internal narrative, something like you're taking too long, your emails should be shorter. Maybe you make a mistake and you hear this voice inside your head saying, I can't believe you missed that. You should have known better. Maybe you're working on a deadline and you're telling yourself you're never going to finish this on time. You always start things too late. And sometimes you may even have that imposter sounding voice, right? It's that voice that tells you that at some point they're going to figure out that you don't belong here. It's that voice that tells you that the only reason you're in the position that you're in is because of a fluke, because maybe there was some sort of a hiring error. If only they knew how disorganized, unqualified, etc. that you are, then they would think otherwise. Maybe you can relate to some of those internal messages. Now, the inner critic doesn't really like to take vacation. The inner critic may follow you from the office home, and you may find that when you try to rest, that's another time the inner critic will crop up. So for example, you might finally sit down, maybe you start watching a TV show or you pour yourself a cup of tea. Next thing you know, you're telling yourself that you have so much to do. You should not be wasting your time resting. Maybe the moment you sit down, you realize, wait a minute, there was that email that I meant to send today and I completely forgot. I should go back and send it right now. You might take some time off and then find yourself at work or doing chores around the house, and you notice how the work has actually piled up, and you might tell yourself something like, I can't believe I wasted an entire morning. And the underlying message here seems to be that you don't deserve to take a break, that you somehow need to earn it, and no matter what you do, it's not enough. Now, the inner critic also likes to appear when you are making important life decisions. I talk to lots of lawyers who are making big decisions about their careers, and those decisions sometimes involve family decisions as well, whether it's extending their family, whether it's leaving or entering into a significant relationship. And what you might find in those situations is that the inner critic speaks up. What if you make the wrong decision? Sometimes the inner critic likes to remind you of that time, even if it was many, many years ago in a completely unrelated situation. Hey, remember that time when you did X and it turned out to be a complete disaster? You're about to do that again. Or maybe your inner critic likes to tell you that you're going to run out of money, you're going to get in way over your head, and hey, if you make the wrong decision, if you take the wrong job, for example, you're going to end up homeless, right? Have you ever heard that voice? That voice will slow you down. It will talk you out of things. It will remind you of your past mistakes, and it will make you feel so scared that you're then frozen out from taking risks or making decisions. And finally, you might find that the inner critic has really interfered with your motivation. So if you grew up in the same era as me, it was that no pain, no gain era. And when I think of workouts, for example, I think of that drill sergeant forcing people to lift heavy objects and they're panting and sweating and they feel like they can't move another step forward, but somebody's yelling at them. And so they do it anyways. And that might be how your inner critic is motivating you. It might just be sitting there telling you to move forward. And you might find that there are whispers, there are nudges, there are voices that are calling to you, inviting you to try out new areas, try out different things, explore new opportunities. But you don't hear them because the inner critic's voice is so loud and you've conditioned yourself to waiting for that voice to be heard before you move forward. And what you might find then is that it's really hard to get motivated unless you have that compelling, loud drill sergeant voice of your inner critic. Now, if you can relate to any of these examples, you are by no means alone. We all have an inner critic. What your inner critic likely sounds like is an internalized messaging of voices from your past, whether it's a family member, maybe it's a parent that was maybe on your case about certain things. Maybe it was a teacher that you had at elementary school or in later years. Maybe it's a client that you work with who is very critical, whose voice keeps running through your head. Maybe it's a colleague of yours who you work with closely and you're starting to internalize their messaging as well. It might be society. So we all know that the world of advertising and different social norms that you may be expected to live up to can place some pretty unrealistic standards on you. And you may have internalized all of that, and it's coming through in the voice of your inner critic. And what I'd like to offer today is that your inner critic isn't necessarily a bad person. It's not a bad critic that's sitting there trying to harm you. Chances are your inner critic is really just trying to protect you. You might think of an overprotective parent, an overprotective mother, overprotective father, overprotective grandparent, perhaps, somebody who's there trying to keep you safe. And they're standing there, they're wringing their hands, they're telling you things. What they're really trying to do is to help you avoid making mistakes and avoid getting hurt. But what you might be doing to try to solve for this inner critic is sometimes very all or nothing. You might find that you are trying to be perfect all of the time so that you can avoid the wrath of your inner critic. There are so many perfectionists out there, and you may think that if you can only do it perfectly, then you are above reproach. And so you don't have to deal with that voice inside of your head. You may also give up on playing big or shy away from opportunities because you do not want to hear the criticism that will flow if you don't get it perfect. And what you might also find, and this is one that I used to really love, is beating other people to the punch, right? I remember watching this TV show when I was a kid. And somebody offered, one of the kids in the show, it was a family ties type show, although I don't know if that was a show. And one of the kids said that they liked to make fun of themselves because they found that if they were the first ones to do it, nobody else could make fun of them as well as they could make fun of themselves. And so it was almost like this protective mechanism. And so you might also find with the critic is that if you're really, really hard on yourself, nobody else out there can be as hard on you as you are on yourself. So in a sense, you're protecting yourself, you're preparing yourself. Nobody else's criticism can feel as stinging as what you can actually deliver to yourself. So what you might find is that you're beating yourself up almost preemptively to prepare yourself for what might come from others. Now, what you'll also find is that these strategies don't make that voice go away. The inner critic is not going to go away because no level of perfect is ever going to be enough. If you stop taking risks, if you stop playing bigger, that's not going to work either because you're going to find that you're very much stagnated. That's when you can typically get stuck. And if you're going around beating yourself up, then you know how exhausting and counterproductive that can be. What you ultimately create in those situations is greater stress at work because you're constantly second guessing yourself and criticizing yourself. You may find you can't rest without thinking of all of the things that you're not doing. You may find that that means that you're increasingly exhausted and you find that there is a lack of peace in your life. You may find that you increasingly have difficulty making decisions because you're afraid you're going to make the wrong one. And finally, you might find that you lack motivation unless the voice of that critic is there to push you. So you might find that you get motivated in fits and starts, and the things that you do feel hard. Overall, what you might find is that you're exhausted and that critic is running the show. You have a lot of negative self-talk. You might experience a lot of self-doubt, lack of confidence, and you might find that you're basically living in fear of your own judgment. Today's episode is about offering a different solution. Now, I talk about taming the inner critic, but that's not actually what we're going to do today. Today, what we're focusing on is making peace with the inner critic. And I've got 5 different steps to follow. And if you are in a situation where you can write things down, take some notes, I would encourage you to do that, because the work that you do around your inner critic is work that is going to lift a weight off your shoulders and open up so many possibilities for you. So the first step that we're going to go to is to, first of all, do an inner critic case study. Now, when we think of our inner critic, chances are it's a little bit of an amorphous, faceless, shapeless, nameless thing that haunts us, right? And if you've ever watched a horror film, then you know how those who create horror films really play on the human imagination to do a lot of the heavy lifting. What you can conjure up in your imagination, I promise you, is way scarier than anything that any film artist, production company can produce on a screen. And the image that comes to mind to me is when you used to watch cartoons, maybe as a kid, and they would show a shadow, right? There would be a shadow on the wall, and the shadow would give the illusion of a very large beast, several, dozens of feet tall and sharp fangs and really scary looking. And then when they would reveal what was actually casting the shadow, it was something much smaller. It was a little mouse. It was something harmless. And I would offer the same is true when it comes to your inner critic. If your inner critic is running the show and you haven't given that critic investigation, what you might find is that the image, the idea of that inner critic is a lot scarier than what is actually there. So let's get to know your inner critic. We can start by giving her a name. You can pick whatever name you like for your critic. I would invite you, as we are speaking, to call her up in your mind's eye. She might have a regular name like Kate or Alice or Joan. By the way, these are all names that I love, and I know people with these names and I love them. So this is not to say that a critic needs to have a particular name. You might give her a name that's more of a label, right? The critic or the watcher or the one with the opinions. You can call your inner critic whatever feels right to you. Now, let's get more granular with her and let's start fleshing out what she actually looks like. If your inner critic was a little human or maybe a large human, what does she look like? What color hair does she have? Is it curly? Is it straight? Is it short? Is it long? Does she have brown eyes, green eyes, big eyes, small eyes? Does she wear glasses? Does she have a large nose, a small nose? Does she smile a lot? Does she frown a lot? How does she dress? What kind of clothing is she wearing? Is she tall? Is she short? Is she large? Is she slim? I invite you to imagine in your mind's eye exactly what she looks like, how she moves, how she speaks. Give her a voice that is more distinct than the one that maybe has been passing through your mind on a less conscious level. Now, you can go another step and ask yourself what this person eats for breakfast. It really does bring someone down to earth when you imagine what they look like in front of a bowl of cereal or a plate of bacon and eggs or whatever it is that your inner critic decides to eat for breakfast. And as I was preparing for today, I was thinking about my inner critic and what would she be eating for breakfast? I decided she's probably on a keto diet because I know for myself when I don't have the carbs, I get a little bit grumpy. So what is your inner critic eating? What is she having for breakfast? Now, getting to know her a little bit more, what are some of your inner critic's favorite lines? What are some of the go-to lines that you hear almost as though they were on repeat? Maybe she's telling you that you're lazy, you're not working hard enough, you're not working fast enough, you don't make good decisions. Maybe she's telling you that you don't know how to say no, that you don't know how to say yes. Maybe she's saying you don't know how to organize your office. Maybe she's saying that you're not very good at legal analysis. I mean, there are all sorts of things that your inner critic could be saying to you. Maybe she doesn't like your appearance. Maybe she doesn't think you get enough exercise. Maybe she doesn't think you take very good care of yourself. So ask yourself and write a list of all the things that your inner critic likes to say to you, because we want to get to know what her go-tos are. Now, once you've identified the go-tos that your inner critic likes to share with you, I would invite you to think about whose voice she has. And chances are, as I mentioned earlier, her voice is a compilation of many different voices. So look at what she's saying, and you might even think about where these sentences first came from, right? If she's saying that you were lazy, for example, did somebody in your life call you lazy? Was it a parent or a teacher? Did you come up with that yourself? Maybe she says that you're disorganized. Where did that come from? Is there a certain standard that you think that you should have that you don't have? Maybe you've been on Pinterest looking at everybody's pristine offices, or, you've been out looking at show homes. This is something I've done recently where we've gone out looking at new homes. And when a house is listed for sale, if you've been to an open house, and those houses look absolutely gorgeous because there's nothing in them. There's no toys, there's no office paper, there's no clutter. And the reason for that is because the people who are selling their houses have gone and rented these giant bins or rental spaces where they can go and put all of the things that they typically have in their house. They've moved that away to be able to reveal to potential buyers just how gorgeous that house is. So do you have some unrealistic expectations about what things should be like, and you're comparing yourself to those unrealistic expectations and then coming up with all the reasons why somehow you are in the wrong here? So again, going back to that voice, is it a societal voice? Is it the voice of a specific person, a parent, a teacher, a boss? Maybe it's a bully from your childhood, a friend that you had who was more like a frenemy. I'm sure we've all had those people in our lives who are our friends on paper, but who say the most hurtful things. So where is that voice coming from? Whose voice is it anyways? Now, once you've identified your inner critic and you've gotten to know her a little bit better, she's got a name, you can identify what she looks like, she has a favorite breakfast item, you know what she's likely to say to you, you know where she probably got these ideas from, I would invite you to think about when in your life your inner critic is at its quietest. That might be when you're out at a party with some of your closest friends and you're socializing. Maybe it's when you're watching a movie and you're really enjoying the storyline. It might be it's when you're shopping and buying new clothes. It might be when you're having a really great conversation with just a single friend of yours. You get to decide. Maybe it's when you're with your kids, when you're cooking. Think about the times in your life where the inner critic is at its quietest. And you might ask yourself what it is in those moments that you're thinking about that allows you to have that peace from your inner critic. Now, I would also invite you to ask yourself, when is she at the loudest? Chances are she is at the loudest when you are about to do something that is new, that is difficult, that is challenging, where there's a potential for failure. That's often when the inner critic likes to pipe up and start pointing out all the ways in which things could potentially go wrong. So just notice that, because you're going to want to know when you can expect to see her so that you know how to respond. Now, a couple more questions that you can ask your inner critic, and these are really important questions. The first is, what does she really want? Go back to that example of the overprotective parent. If your inner critic isn't throwing these labels and these accusations and these allegations at you because she's trying to be cruel or unkind, then what is it that she is trying to do? And it may be that she's trying to protect you. So what is it that she really wants? She wants to keep you safe. She wants to prevent you from making mistakes. She wants to prevent you from being in situations where people are going to judge you. And you might also ask her, what is she afraid of? So think about that. What is it that she's trying to keep you from? And if you look at parents, for example, if I think about when I'm trying to protect my children? What am I trying to protect them from? What am I afraid of? Well, it's afraid of them being sad, or afraid of them being lonely, or afraid of them having opportunities closed off to them. So ask yourself, looking at this inner critic, this person that you're now developing a relationship with, what is it that they are afraid of? So going through that first step, that inner critic case study, already you can see how the exercise isn't so much one of taming that inner critic. Again, this concept of taming just isn't really aligned here. If you can think about situations in your life where you've tried to tame someone or something, tame that piece of hair that always sticks up in the wrong direction, I can guarantee the more you try to tame it, the worse it gets. If you've got a toddler you're trying to tame, that doesn't work. We all know that. And so this idea here is to move away from taming the inner critic and instead moving toward that place of compassion and making peace. So already by getting to know that person, by doing this case study exercise, we've created a persona, we've created a character, somebody who has some depth, somebody who has some granularity to them, and we can start to see how we can feel compassion toward that person instead of this resentment and misunderstanding as to what their motives are. So once we finish the case study, then we want to identify ways in which your inner critic has helped you in the past. So again, we're trying to get to a point where we've got a relationship of compassion with our inner critic. So you can think about the times that she has actually helped you out. And my guess is that she has. When I think of my inner critic, I think she has probably spared me from a very large number of typos. The number of times I've read and reread things because my inner critic wanted me to send the perfect email or file the perfect draft. I've caught many errors as a result of that. So thank you, inner critic, for catching the typos. The inner critic may also be protecting you from making rash decisions. So if you find sometimes you're a little bit impulsive and you want to do something on a whim, maybe your inner critic made sure that you were a little bit more thoughtful. Maybe you shopped around and got a better bargain. Maybe you didn't leave on a cold winter's day without your jacket and a nice warm pair of socks. So your inner critic, chances are, is helping you out in many different ways. She might be keeping you on track. You might find that your inner critic is very driven. She wants the best for you. She wants you to be able to provide for yourself and provide for your family, and to always be able to call the shots when it comes to your career and your life. And so she's driving a very, very important mission. And you may have her to thank for being where you are today. So if you feel like your inner critic deserves to have this thanks, then by all means, please set out the ways in which she has helped you to this point. Now we're going to move on to the next question, which is, what are you not doing that you want to be doing because of your inner critic? So if you find right now that you are in a job that you don't like, but you don't want to leave because your inner critic is raising some concerns about what happens if you leave, if you are in a relationship, whether it's a personal relationship, a friend, or a significant other, maybe it's a professional relationship, maybe it's at work, maybe it's a client, again, a relationship that you don't want to be in, but you're not leaving because your inner critic is talking you out of it. It may be that you are not resting or taking a vacation or engaging in adequate self-care because your inner critic keeps interrupting. Every time you go to take a break, she reminds you that you've still got that to-do list. There's still work to be done. Who are you to be resting? So ask yourself what it is that you're not doing that you want to be doing because of your inner critic. So we've now gone through the first three questions. One is that inner critic case study. The second is identifying how your inner critic has actually helped you. Number 3 is identifying what you're not doing because of your inner critic. And then number 4 is, let's get together, you and your inner critic. Let's take her out for tea. Let's take her out for coffee. And we're going to have a conversation where the goal is actually to make peace. So first of all, let's say you're sitting there face to face, you're looking Kate or Joan or whatever her name is in the eyes, and you want to acknowledge something about her. You want to acknowledge maybe how she's there to help you. She's been there to support you. She's never left. She's always looking out for your best interests. So what can you acknowledge about your inner critic? What can you thank her for? Go back to question number 2. What has she helped you achieve? You can thank her for helping you get to the place that you're at today. Now, to give a real sense of being heard and to create a sense of peace with your inner critic, we are going to give her a seat at the table. You can say to her, you now have a seat at my table. And you might imagine yourself as having an inner board of directors. It's a really great tool for channeling insights and ideas. And you can imagine that there is a table, maybe there are 5 or 6 of your inner advisors. One of them, these are potential real advisors, they may be fictitious advisors, but one of those spaces can be filled by your inner critic. You are now giving her a seat at the table officially. We're not taming her. We're not putting her in a box and telling her we don't want to hear from her anymore. We're giving her a legitimate seat, and we're letting her know that she has an equal say, that we are going to hear her voice. It doesn't mean that we're going to act on her voice. Again, let's go back to that scenario where she's running the show and we're not preventing her, we're not questioning, we're simply acting in reaction to what she is demanding. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about giving her a seat at the table where she has a voice, and we're taking into account what she has to say in the decisions that we're making going forward. Now, having this conversation with her, putting her at ease, offering her a seat at the table, what is it that she no longer needs to be afraid of? Assuming that your inner critic has been motivated out of a fear of wanting to keep you safe, a desire to protect you, that there's something deep down that she has been trying to avoid. What is it that she no longer needs to be afraid of? And when you ask this question of yourself, and when you answer it for your inner critic, what you might find is that the answers are ones that stem back from years ago, when you were less experienced, when you were less mature, when you had less know-how, when you had less knowledge, when you had less power. Chances are there are things that have happened in your formative years where you have felt like you were powerless, that this is a situation you don't want to get back into all over again, and you're no longer vulnerable. You're no longer going to fall into situations like that. And so you might be able to then say to your inner critic, listen, you don't need to be afraid of that anymore because I'm a grown woman. I can take care of myself. I now have the skills and tools that I need to move forward. The next thing you'll want to explain to your inner critic is how things are going to be different. Now that you've sat down and you've had this conversation, you're no longer at war with each other. You are having grown-up conversations. There's an equal exchange of information. How will things be different? And you might say to her, I'm going to listen to what you have to say, but I'm still going to move forward, even if it's something that you're not in support of. If I decide that this is the right move, I'm still going to do it. If I'm sitting down and I decide to take a break, if I decide that rest is what's most important, you need to trust me that I've made the right decision for us. And then finally, what is it that she needs to know? So what does she need to know going forward? Well, that you'll take care of her, that you'll take care of yourself, that whatever it is that she was trying to keep you safe from, you've got it. So let's move now to step 5, which is to create a model in your mind's eye, a mental model of how you're going to respond to your inner critic in the future. Now, we know that she's not going anywhere. In fact, we've given her a seat at the table. And so we actually expect that she's going to continue to do much of what she has been doing in the past. So that means that when you're at work and you're sitting down to do that really complicated drafting assignment, you can expect her to pipe up and say, you're never going to finish this. You're not smart enough. You're not going to do this fast enough. So-and-so down the hall would do this in 5 minutes. It's going to take you 5 hours. So we know that the voice is going to be there. We know that the inner critic is going to continue to do her job. So what is it that you're going to do in response when that happens? Number 1 is to accept that it's completely normal, that your inner critic is there. She continues to serve her purpose. And we're going to accept that she is trying to protect you. Again, we're going to draw on that image of the overprotective parent. Your inner critic isn't there to stop you. She's simply there to help you. We're going to step 3, remind ourselves that she has a seat at the table. You're going to ask yourself, what is it exactly that she's saying? And you're going to consider her opinion, but it's not the end. What she says to you, what she offers, isn't necessarily the truth. If she tells you that you're lazy, true, there may be times in your life where you do choose to be lazy, where you do choose not to do the work, and maybe you should do the work. But there are also many times in your life where you are not lazy. And so for her to be assigning a label of lazy, for example, or whatever other label your inner critic might run to, while there may be some truth in it, it is not the absolute truth. And so we're going to question what it is that she has to say, and we're not going to let her opinion be the final say. We're going to consider it, and then we're going to move forward with the best decision. So that's step 4, is considering her opinion, weighing it, and moving forward. And then finally, we can thank her. Thank you for trying to protect me, but we've got this. So overall, I outlined 5 different steps for you to use to create peace with your inner critic. That first step, of course, is the inner critic case study. What does she look like? What's her name? What does she dress like? What are her favorite go-tos? Whose voice is she really repeating? When is she at her quietest? When is she at her loudest? What does she really want? And what is she afraid of? Step 2 is to identify ways in which your inner critic has helped you in the past. Number 3 is to ask yourself what you are not doing that you want to do because of your inner critic. Number 4 is to imagine if you took your inner critic out for coffee, for tea, what would you tell her that would create peace? So again, that's acknowledging her. It's giving her a seat at the table. It's explaining to her that she doesn't need to be afraid, that things are going to be different going forward. And here's what she needs to know. And then finally, that step 5, which is to create a model for yourself, a protocol to follow, where in the future you can respond to your inner critic, acknowledge that what she's saying is normal. This is what she does. She's trying to protect you. She's got a seat at the table, but we get to question her opinion. We can consider it, weigh it, move forward, and thank her for trying to protect you, and then move forward. Now, why this approach will work. As long as you are fighting with your inner critic, you are fighting with a part of yourself. You will continue to be at war with yourself, and that is exhausting. Your attention is focused on you and on fixing or avoiding or punishing. When you finally learn how to make peace with your inner critic, your attention is freed up and you can finally turn it to growth, opportunity, and creativity. In order to do this work, there are a few skills that are required. Number 1, you'll need to use your imagination. This whole exercise, this whole podcast has been you exercising your imagination to think about your own critic, to give her her own name, to think about the situations where this is live for you. So you need to use your imagination to better understand what is going on here. You will need to find compassion for that part of yourself. When we judge our inner critic, we are responding in kind. It doesn't help. What we need to do is find that compassion and create that peace. You will need to question the truth of what your inner critic is offering to you and notice that she does not always speak the truth. One of the reasons why we can get so caught up in the voice of our inner critic is that we hear it. It gives us a label. It tells us that we've done something wrong, that we're too slow, that we should have caught it. It gives us all these different messages, and we believe those messages without actually questioning them. And that has this really negative impact on our self-esteem. So here what we're doing is we are learning how to question the voice of the inner critic. And as we question it, we start to see ourselves in a much more positive light. Another skill that is required is a willingness to let go of a part of yourself that you've gotten very used to. So if you've ever had that experience of having an overbearing person in your life, whether it's a parent or a friend or a partner, and all of a sudden that person goes away, it's almost like there's a vacuum or a vortex because all of a sudden you've got so much more freedom and it can feel a little bit uncomfortable at first simply because you're not used to it. And when the critic is you, when it's a voice inside of your own head, you're so used to hearing it. And to say goodbye, to break up with that part of yourself might feel really difficult. There's almost like a loss there, a grieving period, because you're moving away from a strategy that used to really work for you and you're saying goodbye to it. And you don't yet know what that's going to look like as you move forward. Finally, you're going to need to be willing to take action even when you have doubt, uncertainty, and dread. So even though you may be able to find peace with your inner critic, it doesn't mean that you're no longer going to feel that sense of doubt, uncertainty, or dread when you are trying new things or challenging things or when you find yourself in difficult situations. And that is okay. Now, the results that you're going to create is number one, you're going to have so much greater peace of mind. If you can imagine that the war with yourself is now over, there is so much more peace. There's so much more space. You're no longer at war with yourself. You will find that your confidence slowly begins to increase. When you start to dismantle the negative messaging that is going on inside of your mind, then what you'll find is that you feel better about yourself. You start to notice the things that you're doing right. You start to build on the things that you're doing right, and that confidence continues to grow. What you'll also find is that you feel less stress and less fear. Yes, it is true. Other people out there, they may judge you, they may criticize you, they may tell you that you're too slow, too whatever, but you're no longer having that echo inside your mind where the inner critic is chiming in and amplifying those messages. Instead, what's able to happen, what you're able to do, is you're able to take that criticism, the external criticism, and weigh it a little bit more thoughtfully because you've been practicing that with your own internal critic. Finally, what you'll find is that you start to feel greater compassion for yourself, first of all, and a greater compassion that extends to others. So this, my friend, has been a pretty deep discussion about how to make peace with your inner critic. I'm also going to offer you another podcast episode. It might be next week or in the weeks that follow about your inner mentor, because the inner mentor is almost like the counterbalance to your inner critic, and she deserves a place at the table as well. So I'm going to give you some ideas about how you can get to know her better. Now, for any of you who are interested in doing deeper work, in entering into a coaching relationship, whether it's to help you navigate a transition or to improve your practice or find more joy in your work, you know that you can reach out to me, that you can contact me to set up a consult. I would also like to offer that I am running group programs. I'll be starting at my next group in January of 2024. That is for women lawyers. The group is capped at 8 women lawyers. And so if that is something that appeals to you, I highly encourage you to check it out. You can text me. There's a link on the website. You can go to it and see for yourself if it's something that you're interested in. Again, I would just love the opportunity to be able to support you further in helping you achieve what it is that you want with greater ease and greater joy. So with that, my dear friend, thank you for joining me this week. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.